So welcome, Mariana,
Thank you.
to this quick chat we're going to have about your upcoming workshop, just to give people a little hint as to what they can expect and why they should attend. Um, uh, it's actually really beautiful. I feel like I'm bringing a little bit of Esalen with me since you used to teach at Esalen and live in California for so many years, and my inspiration being so strong after my trip there. It's really nice to bring kind of a touch of all of that wisdom to Malta. So super excited about it.
Yeah, and as your excitement for California has been brewing, equal as my excitement to discover, what is Malta and who is in Malta and what are people dreaming of and curious about and how the cultures blend or the whole cultural engagement is my greatest pleasure when I travel.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's amazing. Like-minded souls, we're connected across geographies through our seeking and our like-minded interests. So it's going to be beautiful. So I just wanted to start with a really generic question on what can someone expect from coming to this workshop?
The first thing that comes to mind is togetherness, the frames of yoga and psychology. So when I think of yoga, most people generally think of the asanas and series of poses, and that's very much part of what I do and what I'll bring. But there's so many deeper dimensions to yoga that are quite easily accessed, and they might be more devotional, they might be more meditative or more connected to the breath and visual. So we're going to bring in the deeper dimensions of yoga in a very accessible way, and then touch on, I think, what is the most exciting movement in psychology in the last several decades in my personal experience, which is this whole world of somatics, of psychology, and an unwinding and a knowing of ourselves that includes the body. When I first started studying somatic psychology, it was after my doctorate and after my licenses and after my yoga certifications, but there was still a missing piece. My clients weren't changing as much as I wanted them to change. I wasn't changing as much as I wanted to change, even though we had so much understanding. So right back then, it was about 20 years ago, that's when this word somatics it was a foreign word, and it still is in most of the world of psychology, but it was a foreign idea, and I found one person who was doing it, and that led me to a 3-year training in this method called Somatic Experiencing, created by Peter Levine. But in the last few decades, there's a number of methods that have arisen, and they're all powerful, and what they share in common is learning how to access our psychology, our emotions, our nervous system, our inner reality in the body, and work in the body to integrate, to process, to metabolize, to transform. And when I started doing that in myself, in my yoga practice, in my practice as a psychotherapist, it was a game changer. And suddenly there was a way that all of this understanding could start being felt in the body, and in the body I found things to be so much more workable and so much more fluid and more effective. So we have that, and then when we drop that into this broad, vast, 5,000-ish year tradition of yoga, one of the longest sustaining religious spiritual traditions in the world, then we have an endless toolbox of practices and methods and perspectives, not only to address our wounds, but to address our wholeness and our becoming and our thriving and our possibility.
So for someone who's never done any kind of somatic practices, even though we do a lot without realizing that there's somatic practices, what would the workshop look like? Like, are they going to be listening to a talk? Are they going to be, moving on a yoga mat? Are they going to be, so like, if I'm trying to visualize, okay, I'm going to do a somatic experiencing practice, what does that actually look like?
Yeah. So a little bit of everything you just said, and it's important I'm glad that you mentioned that, because in these trainings I've been doing all of these years, people are welcome to come, with a little or a lot of experience of yoga, a little or a lot or no experience with somatics and psychology. I've worked hard over many years to learn to contain a multi-level group of people, and it's exciting that way. And so it's going to be a little bit of me teaching, a lot of people being given and exploring practices in real time in themselves, with each other, coming back together with the questions, with our own personal experience, and then taking on piece by piece. So it'll be a flow of teaching. Oftentimes I'll demonstrate something, people will try it. And what I've seen over all the years is that the best questions and the real learning comes from people's own experience. So once people get engaged in experience, then the questions come, their own insights come, their insights catalyze other people's insights. And then as a group, we take on a piece. And what I love about this particular method called Somatic Experiencing, which isn't yogic in its essence, I took it over many years and combined it with yoga, but the founder, Peter Levine, started working on this 40 years ago. And what he's been able to do is just make things very accessible, bring these practices and bring them down, powerful knowings and understandings, and bring them to these very accessible, bite-sized, teachable, practicable methods that give experience. And that's what the big aha is for me, that there's not just a bunch of theory, but simple things that can be easily taught, easily practiced. Of course, practice of anything deepens with time, but I want people to come away with, oh, like I can do this and this and this in my own practice, and I can maybe call this and this and this person who I met at the workshop and say, hey, do you want to try to do this with me?
I can just ask about the trauma part, because nowadays a lot of people are turning to somatic practices as a form of trauma healing, and there's a lot of communication about somatic therapy in the trauma healing space. So is this workshop, going to help people deal with their traumas? Like, what's sort of the discussion? Like, how does trauma get woven into the workshop?
So for me, the practice of working somatically or in the body with therapy is inseparable from the discussion of trauma. So as we all know, mostly since the pandemic, people just started talking about trauma. And before that, it was being mindful, at least in California, and everything turned to mindfulness. Now everything's turning to trauma. But although everybody's talking about it and there's an awareness of trauma, there needs to be a depth of study and understanding when we're really talking about trauma healing. So one of the great ahas of the newer somatic methods and somatic trauma healing methods, it's often for me in the same sentence, is one of the big ahas was that trauma went from being defined as something that happened, this happened and therefore I have trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder in the psychiatric and psychological handbooks, originally were about, this or can happen, and then this, and then you feel trauma. And suddenly there was a big aha, and the big aha was that trauma is not defined by what happened, but by how an individual experiences whatever has happened. And it's why 3 different children in the same family could be exposed to the same type of experience. And one ends up in adulthood doing somatic workshops and studying therapies and inner work, and the other one ends up, with an addiction to drugs or alcohol, and another one ends up sort of neutral, because we're all such different beings. And then as the knowledge of trauma has been developing over the last really only 20, 30 years, there came a notion of everyday trauma. And this was even before the pandemic, where it can be the trauma of just living as a person, as a sensitive person, in an escalating and changing and often frightening world. And then we threw the pandemic into this, and then there's like this collective global thing that was scaring people, that was impacting people. And it really took the pandemic for people to start talking about trauma. And so what I love to do is bring in real study about trauma, and not this easy kind of trauma-informed label. And again, what the somatic practices are designed to do is to offer safe, small, safe, really underlined, safe, accessible, small, doable pieces where we start to just touch the wounds with love and learn how to do that skillfully. Because what was happening in a lot of the old school methods, different kinds of breath work or medicine work or whatever people are doing, is it was the idea that we go in and go to the core of the trauma and get to the bottom of it and feel it all the way in some way, and then it's going to get exorcised from us. And what was happening over all those years is a lot of re-traumatizing of ourselves in our therapies and in these over intensive practices that we're trying to like unearth and excavate trauma. And as the deeper research and time has shown, it's really quite the opposite that's effective. Going in and creating safety and going in and touching trauma with just little bits of skill, little bits of understanding, little bits of relationship, little bits of love, doing it like micro bite-sized pieces at a time, and then learning the skills to meet it as it keeps reemerging in our lives inevitably over and over again, is a much safer, more effective way to do it, and also like a lot more delightful, because it isn't like we go in to do trauma and then we come out of the workshop having survived. We go in, and one of my dearest mentors, John Wellwood, he passed away a few years ago, but he showed and taught, and I see this over and over again, that oftentimes it's really at the bottom of our deepest wounds, and through these traumas that our deepest gifts are hidden, and they're really our jewels and our deep intuitions and knowings. And those were so precious and vulnerable that in the way that our lives and families and cultures developed, we had to protect them, and we developed so many protective structures called the defense mechanisms in psychology. But they were protective, so not only do we get the benefit of learning to unwind our trauma, but when we do that, the big surprise is like all the gifts and the ahas and the inner wisdom and the uniqueness that starts to come. And can we do all of this in one weekend? No, but we can make a first pass. And I want people to have tools, as I said earlier, that they can take and practice over time. And like yoga practice, the somatic practices, the therapeutic practices, they're not a quick fix. When they're done well, they're empowering, they're giving skill sets, they're providing relational context, and then they're actually practices that are sustainable and grow and deepen with time. And all the shortcuts, we can make little hacks, but shortcuts to transformation, it's not my style. I don't really believe in it. After having tried so many of them for so many years. And because I worked in California all these years and taught at grad schools, I had the people who came in having done, blasted their psyches with every medicine and massive meditation retreat and huge, breathwork experiences. And what we learn in trauma and somatic healing is to go fast, is to go slow. Like the less is more. Really just reveals itself. But what I want to do is not just tell people about this, but show them so that they can have their own insights and make it their own. And then we have a little link between California and the USA and these newer methods. And really, they're still quite unknown in the United States. In California, we might use these words and people in the therapeutic field say, okay, but I've just moved to the East Coast where, the big Ivy League schools are. And I was I think I mentioned to you in a previous conversation, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs one of the programs at Harvard's greatest psychiatric institute, and I said, is Harvard ready? Can we bring some of these things in? And he said, not yet. So these are kind of newer, but not new since the pandemic. That's not enough time, but newer in the last decades, and eventually to be integrated into this field.
Yeah. Beautiful. I was actually going to ask you a question that you answered in that really beautiful answer. Maria, can I just check, because there's a slight feedback on your microphone. Did it move position, or is the wire moving at all?
No, but I can just try to
Should
change
be.
its placement. No,
It just felt like maybe the wire was being moved or something. Because sometimes when you touch the wire, it kind of makes a little squeaky. It wasn't too bad, but we should be able to edit it out. But yeah, I was actually, as you were, like just before you started that last piece, I was going to ask you to speak to someone who, we have many people who want to heal, but these workshops scare them because, trauma is sensitive and it can be so scary. And that's why I love what you said, because it doesn't have to be scary. We don't need to go full blast. Like that delicate approach is just so beautiful, because then you can just take it to your own comfort zone, right? Like you don't need to go out, into a territory where you're not feeling safe. So I really love that. I have to say that I personally learned a lot from you about that, because I have that tendency to go all out. And yeah, it's been really beautiful to learn more about that kind of way of approaching our wounds. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm glad you highlight that, because I say this at the beginning of a lot of workshops over the years. Like, my goal is that even though we're studying trauma and somatics and yoga, that my goal is that people come out of the weekend buoyant and uplifted and with greater ease. And what is likely to emerge, because it has in the past, is as we're unwinding these things, there's a lot of connectedness. There's a lot of, you're smiling, like there's a lot of joy that comes up. And when we gently unearth these pieces of our psyches, and then we discover all over the room and our companions that it's not, it's unique, but also not so different. There's also like a feeling of support and holding. And even if we know this intellectually, when we dare to let out these pieces of ourselves and near them, and it's met with, and it's really received. So this is another piece, that we have these wounds that happen in relationship, whether it was our parents or siblings or our immigration or whatever it was. And we have these wounds, and then people go to these solitary environments to try to heal them, to a deep meditation retreat, all these yoga classes that we're all there together, but we're just end up, often not talking to someone else and leaving. And here it's that another aha is that the wounds that occurred in relationship are best healed in relationship, and not just in a primary relationship, but through relating to others. So that's another piece that I immensely value. And it's exciting to discover, you said, the like-minded people and how we converge, and also to discover the differences. I sometimes bring in a word from my language. I taught in Spain a lot, and I speak Spanish, but I would be translating a word, and everyone's like, no, that doesn't really work here because of this, and this triggers this in our culture. And we say, okay, let's take the idea and see what is the word, and what is the shift that needs to be made over here to speak to your culture, or even individuals. My dog. That individuals will say, because what we're trying to do is access the inner capacity for healing within ourselves, and we're all made of different stuff. So you and I talked about, Peter Levine talks about this, he calls it resourcing, or we're learning to access wholeness and space and goodness in our bodies. And I was teaching one of my first workshops on this long ago, and there was a retired school teacher. And she said, we keep talking about resourcing, but in my profession, that means manuals and books and things like that I have to do on the weekends. Like, I don't want that. And I said, great, let's find a word for you. And I don't even remember what it was. She knew exactly, her body knew exactly what it was. So we find our, similarities, and then we also get to celebrate our uniqueness and our differences.
I'd love to just dive a little bit deeper into that word resourcing, because that's another word that I actually hadn't come across until we started working together. And I really like the concept because, again, in healing and in self-development, they can often be like too much focus on our wounds and on all the things we want to change. And yeah, sometimes we forget to draw also on our strength. So maybe like you can just give someone listening a little bit of a explanation of what resourcing is and how that's going to be discovered through this workshop.
Yeah, of all the many tools Peter taught and I've shared with others over the years, it's resourcing that usually kind of comes to the top as a great gem. And it's surprising because resourcing is about learning to discover pleasure, wholeness, spaciousness, equanimity, as a felt sense in the body. And one might think, well, why are we doing that when we're trying to address our trauma? And one response is that for so many of us, we learned and got a lot of repetition of dealing with our pains and our fears and our contractions and our wounds. But in the process, we weren't modeled and taught how to access pleasure, wholeness, well-being, like as minute sensation in the body. Sometimes people will just they'll say, I don't feel it anywhere. And then we ask, like, is there anywhere, any part of your psyche or your being where you feel it? They say, oh yeah, in my third finger, my fingertip. That makes sense, but that's where I feel it. I was like, great. And then we explore it there. And then we find the edges, and we can start from anywhere. And when I first did this 3-year somatic training, the modules were for 4 days. So I'm going to bring a lot into 2 days, and, including yoga, which we just touched upon at the beginning. But we were, the first 4 days, the first 32 hours of my training was about resourcing. And I remember being there like, what? Like, I'm doing 32 hours of being with other people and discussing, where do you feel pleasure? Where do you feel peace? What's happening in your body? And hours and hours and hours of that. And had that very question, like, what does this have to do with trauma? And over the years, the lip response is everything. Because we are, for one, I've put it's on my website, it's in everything that I've ever said. I deeply believe that a whole psychology is not only about dealing with our wounds and our hurts and the things that happen to us, but about discovering our wholeness, our uniqueness, our gifts, our capacities. They're not only so important, but they're in a deep dance with each other. So why the resourcing is taught at the beginning is because we literally create space in our bodies and in our awareness and in our hearts. We create safe space. We discover that which can hold and receive the wounds. And we create lots of love and space and goodness. And then we touch down into the contractions and the trauma and the stories. We touch them with love, and then we bring them back to the wholeness, and then they become workable. They become less overwhelming. They become actually workable, right? For most of us, even those, it's really important to emphasize. Some people say, well, I feel all of this, but nothing bad happened to me. And then, like, behind that is, I don't even deserve to heal, or I don't even deserve for my pain or my wounds to be recognized because, this and this happened to those other people. And that's why, like, the notions of everyday trauma and the pandemic kind of leveling out, like, the human experience as our experience, the intensity of being alive every single day. right, is so much to digest and process. Even if people have put it in a box or, made their world smaller, the person who thinks they have the least intensity, right? Every human being has an inner intensity. So the whole principle about resource is really opening up space and love and goodness in like millimeters and teeny pockets of our being, and each one that gets liberated is space that can handle the parts of ourselves that are more delicate and harder to deal with. And it's like, first we get to talk about it and understand the idea, but then we get to experience it, and that's when it gets really juicy and interesting. And when people say, oh, this is how I experience it, this is what's happening in me, that's when it gets real, and that's when we get into relationship and some of that wonderful interpersonal healing happens. And I hope in this workshop, I perhaps naively or based on a lot of experience expect that there's going to be a we at the end, and a unique moment in time, where we get to come together and share in a healing that is kind and intimate and manageable and joyful.
Sounds like a perfect place to tie it together. Thanks for sharing all of that. I think from that people can really get a much better understanding of what to expect, because there aren't actually many workshops on the island where you can get to kind of actually experience yoga, experience your body, but then also have chance for questions and interacting with each other. As you said, a lot of these practices are very individual. We come, we do our practice, say hi and bye, and then we go. So I'm really looking forward to kind of all the interactions we're going to have together, and the chance to experience, but then also ask questions and have that reflection. It sounds really beautiful.
And I think one piece I want to add, because yoga is less new, so we focused on the somatic pieces, but all of these practices are going to take place in flows of yoga asana. We use that as another vehicle. We use some of the deeper practices of yoga as resources themselves to create this buoyancy. So for the yoga lovers, saying, well, what does this have to do with yoga? It actually has everything to do with yoga, because when we take these practices and then we drop them into our yoga asana practices, they get really, it fills with possibility. Because when I was learning, before I learned these practices, I'd be doing my yoga asana or my teacher training and say, like, why is my mind traveling to this experience? I should be one-pointed, and I shouldn't be like having these memories come up. And then I was taught all this while I was learning to be a yoga teacher, and I was like, oh, my body's actually gifting me with this memory, and my body's gifting me with this emotion. And suddenly there were articles coming out in our big American magazine. Somebody called me to interview me on an article, is it okay to cry in yoga class? and this big thing, oh my goodness, it can be okay to cry in yoga, to feel in yoga, to feel angry in yoga, to feel unquiet in yoga, and rather it being a context to learn to include and feel and embrace all of it.
I'm so glad that you added that, because you're so right. And like yoga as a practice, in my experience, is so much richer and deeper and offers us so much more when we bring in this sort of ability to feel deeply into it. So thanks for adding that piece. Just gonna, we only have like a few minutes left. So do you want to say ask a few things about Malta?
Yeah. So through Yasmin, I have been introduced to the country of Malta. I'm not proud of my ignorance, that I didn't know anything about Malta before. Those who know me know that my greatest love is of the world and the planet and countries. And I feel like each of them are part of our larger self. And that's what I find extremely meaningful. So Yasmin is the first person I ever met from Malta, and thankfully, by meeting her, I got out my maps and my Google Maps, and I started, looking where it was in the world, and started looking at pictures. And she started explaining to me about the cultures that informed Malta, and I love it if you can share a little bit, because as I say that I'm going to Malta, and I tell people, and I want to share this with my people, and people don't know very much about it at all. And yeah, tell us anything about what.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not surprising that people don't know much about us because we're really small. We're a really tiny 100 square miles practically island, but we have a really beautiful and interesting history. Many people know Malta just as a place with amazing weather and amazing sun and sea. We have like the most clear blue sea ever. But we actually have so much more. Like the cultural aspect is really rich, as you said, because we were touched by the influence of so many different other cultures, right? So from the going back to the Ottoman Empire, to the British, through all different European cultures via the Knights of St. John, who were, Knights Hospitallers who made Malta their home for over 600 years. So there's, real touches of so many different cultures here. And for me personally, one of the things I find so interesting about the island is we have this real matriarchal history where we have these beautiful temples to the divine feminine that are 1,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. We still don't know exactly how they were built because they were, huge rock slabs that, even by modern day standards would be really difficult to maneuver, and, artifacts that were, sort of beyond our understanding of the technologies available at that time. And there are many of these temples, and most of them are oriented with the sun and different star constellations. So on the summer solstices and the equinoxes, the light shines directly onto the altars of these temples. So for me personally, I just love that history of the sacred feminine, and also when Malta became Catholic, that tradition has been really woven in. We have a real deep devotion to the feminine, even within our Catholic tradition. So yeah, there's a lot to explore here, and for anyone coming to attend this workshop from abroad, like we'll also be happy, to recommend people places to stay and things to do. I know during the workshop we're gonna meet on the beach for a few sunset swim time, which will be lovely. But yeah, it's a really beautiful island to explore, especially if you have a love of traveling.
Wonderful. And if I could ask you, I found most cultures come with their gifts and their wisdom, and then often their shadows, of course. But what would you say is like what are the treasures of the people and their own wisdom?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that you say, the light and the shadow, because I think our light and shadow here is very connected. Like we have this really beautiful gift, being an island nature, of being very welcoming to foreigners, like really interested and curious, and we like hosting people. So there's this real sort of openness. That at times has also been a shadow, when there's been sort of fears of, certain groups of people or whatever. So, maybe from certain Maltese people would think, oh no, we're not open because of, certain racism and certain, fears. But I think actually our culture is very open and very welcoming. So, and everyone speaks English. So, as a foreigner visiting here, it is really easy to connect to the local culture. And most Maltese people are really happy to like recommend where to go and what to do and tell you their whole life story.
I know it's people are deep into their summer planning, and this is happening next month. But particularly, want to extend the invitation, and maybe some of my European friends and readers might just decide to hop over and join us. And as Yasmin said, we planned into the workshop because I so value the relationality. We planned into the workshop time to be together on the beach and celebrate. And relate to each other. And more likely, for those who don't get there, I'm so honored to get to be an ambassador for a week, and really look forward to sharing and just helping us, those of us, most of the world who doesn't know very much about the rest of the world, to acknowledge and become aware and become curious, like I have, about your country.
Yeah, beautiful. Hopefully it won't be your last visit. We'll be tempting you back again and again.
It's this interesting intuition that I think we've silently passed back and forth, but it feels like a beginning of something, and I have no need to know what that something is. It's called so deeply. I guess I'll just add, just for our archives, whether we share it or not, that Yasmin and I were just getting to know each other this last year, and just in one conversation, she said, "I'm just going to drop a seed. If you ever want to come to Malta," and that seed just planted so quickly. The next day, inside of me at night, I'm dreaming of Malta and online, and where is it? What do they speak? And that seed really wanted to grow.
Yeah. It's funny because a lot of people who visit Malta have this very deep calling to be here, even foreigners who come to live here. There is something about this land that it does call people in. So, Mariana, thank you so much for taking this time to explain to everyone, and for everyone listening. Like, we're just so excited, both of us, to host you all here, and we just really look forward to it. So, see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon.